and we'll get started pretty quickly here. Most all of the images in this presentation are mine. A lot of the Tamron presentations are collaborations, but I do get a lot of bird photography in. The image you see here is actually one of my neighborhood osprey. If you're a parrot head, we've named he and his mate Frank and Lola. We'll have a couple more Frank and Lola shots later, but thanks to Action Camera for allowing us to do the presentation, and I hope you pick up another some tips out of it. It's not always all about the telephoto shots. Some days you go out. This was at a birding festival that I was teaching at in Florida, and right after, or 20 minutes after I took these beautiful sunrise shots with the wide angle lens, a severe thunderstorm came through. So always be prepared when you're out shooting, of course, for any sorts of weather, and take the appropriate precautions. Bring the. It's never a bad idea to check the weather forecast if it looks like it's getting sketchy, and certainly dress accordingly, or have a way to get to shelter if you need to. But this shot was made with the 28-75, kind of an all-purpose lens on the Sony camera platform, and I shot this at wide open at f2.8. For some reason, I didn't put my notes up here. I think it was about 1/160th of a second at ISO 100, and I was just capturing the sunrise as much as I was the birds flying over, but the birds were kind of an added benefit to a shot like this. So remember, don't always just think about your telephotos, especially early morning, late afternoon. The wide angle lenses with birds flying to either where they're roosting in the evening, or flying from where they've been roosting overnight to where they're going to go hunt for food for the day, can always make some great pictures too. So definitely keep that in mind. I'm going to talk first about setting your camera modes. Now, if you're a veteran photographer, this will be kind of a refresher. Maybe time for you to go get your, refill your coffee or something like that. But for those of you who are maybe new to changeable lens photography or adjustable cameras, I think there will be some tips and pointers here that'll help you maybe move on to the next step. So every camera or most cameras, until you get into the real high-end pro cameras, are going to have an auto everything setting, and that can be your best friend. I have friends who are accomplished, nationally known wedding photographers that will shoot in the auto everything or program mode for weddings. But again, they know how their camera behaves, they know how their lighting equipment behaves, and they know when to override it too. The problem with the auto everything mode is the camera can give you perfectly exposed photos, but they may be perfectly exposed blurs simply because the camera doesn't know exactly what you're doing or what you want to photograph or what you're envisioning. So as you can graduate from that, if you're a beginner, the sooner the better, and at least go to those scene modes. This may be on an analog dial, or it might be on an LCD panel. Check your owner's manual, or again, your camera body maker, and I'll refer to this a lot. The camera body makers all have, generally on their YouTube channel, great tutorials that'll usually be broken down for many of the popular features and functions, and they'll even be broken down not just to a group of cameras, but often to specific models, so that you can find exactly where all these features and functions live on your camera, or if you can determine whether or not they actually do live on your camera. But the scene modes, you'll see a mountain, which is great for landscape. You'll see a flower, which is great for close-up. You'll see kind of usually an icon that looks like a runner in motion, and that would be the action photography one, and that would be good for your birding or any kind of fast-moving subjects. And then once you get familiar with that, I go back in photography long enough that my first cameras were film, of course, and they had no exposure automation at all. I had to adjust the shutter speed and the aperture based on the ISO or ASA speed of the film that I told the light meter I was using, and I had to determine what was right and what was wrong there, and line up a couple of needles in a viewfinder. And eventually we got to the point where the camera did a lot of that for you. So we can use the aperture priority mode, or AV if you're a Canon shooter, or the shutter priority mode, or TV. And those will allow you more controls. And then of course, everybody is a photographer until you get to M, manual exposures. And sometimes without too much trouble, you can get great results with a little practice and knowing, again, how your camera works in the manual mode. And sometimes it's going to be important. Like, for instance, this next image, again, not a bird in flight, but a snowboarder in flight. And when we're out doing some stock photography and some tutorial videos at Tahoe a couple of years ago, we set up one of our tech team members, who has retired to become a TV guy now, used to work at Tahoe, so he gathered up a bunch of his friends and had them come off of this jump for us. And we determined, since it was going to be a bright, clear day, very few clouds, we were going to be able to go with a basically the same exposure pretty much all day long. So we did some test shots and got everything set up, and we ended up at 1,000th of a second, which was a high enough shutter speed to freeze the motion of the borders coming off the jump. You can see a little snow flying off there too from the jump. And we determined that we were going to need to be at f22 so that we were able to carry the depth of field all the way through the scene. We focused about a third of the way into the scene, so we got the maximum depth of field, and set the focus manually as well. And as the snowboarders came by, all we had to do was basically push the shutter button, click, 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 as they came down the run, and got several shots of them coming off and in the air. But in this case, again, ISO 800, and we set that manually. Now, sometimes it's if you're in a manual exposure mode, but you still want a little exposure automation, or if you want to maintain a specific shutter speed aperture combination, like if this was a cloudy day, we probably would have gone to, or a partly cloudy day, we probably would have gone to auto ISO. And again, this you can find in most newer cameras. And again, check your manual or check the body maker's tutorials. But that way we could have maintained that 1,000th of a second f22 exposure, but as maybe clouds obscured the sun, the ISO would go up and go back down when the sun came back out, so that our exposure still would remain the same. Now, we might have also had to use, if we had gone to auto ISO with manual exposure, we might have had to use a exposure compensation, which I'll also talk about a little bit more during the presentation, so that all these things tie in together for you. We'll talk first about aperture and depth of field. It's a little less important when you're shooting action, but it's the thing that hangs us up most as photographers, especially those of us who are maybe new to photography. It's a little counterintuitive, because the aperture numbers are a mathematical formula that represent the diameter or opening of the lens versus the focal length of the lens. And the small numbers represent the large apertures. The large numbers, the big numbers, represent the small apertures. So that's kind of the first thing that hangs us up. Now, also, small apertures, or large apertures, I should say, the small numbers, will also give you shallow depth of field. Basically, just maybe what you're focused on is going to be in focus. So as you stop down, as you see by kind of the graphic example here, as we go from a large aperture, maybe up to about 5.6, and even if you have a, you know, the maybe basic kit lenses that came with your camera, you might only be at 5.6, or if you have a Tamron all-in-one, it might go to f6.3, but that's still a reasonably large aperture. And as you zoom in, you're going to be able to maintain, if you need to, that separation of the subject from the background. And then as we stop down further, the background becomes more and more in focus. And maybe here's a better example for you. Again, not a bird in flight, but a good example. That large aperture, we focused on this pretty blue flower, and it's our emphasis here. It's our main subject that we want the viewer's eye to be drawn to. But as we begin to stop down, and I encourage you to go out, even if it's just in the backyard, and it could be with any subject, birds, flowers, whatever, experiment with your apertures and different focal lengths on your lens to see those combinations. As I mentioned, when I shot film back in the day, I kept a little spiral notebook with me and I wrote down all the exposure data so that I could learn from my successes and, more importantly, learn from my failures, or the ones that didn't turn out. And I could say, okay, if I'm in this situation, this combination didn't work, but this combination did. Now, the beauty of digital cameras is they record all that data for you, and it's transferred to your computer. Typically, when you download the images, you can usually find that data in your editing programs, or even just if you're looking at previews of your photos, you can generally bring up the data. So again, you can learn from your successes and from your failures, and I learn a lot more when I make mistakes than I do when I'm hitting on all 8 cylinders. So it's important to track that data and see what happens. And as you can see here, when we stop down to F11 and F22, there's that annoying piece of background furniture in the background that draws the viewer's eye away. It makes the image less pleasing to view. So again, experiment with a larger and smaller aperture to see what's going to work in the situation that you're shooting. Shutter speed is probably the big thing to understand when we're shooting fast-moving subjects like birds in flight. And again, these are fractions of a second, a little more basic. It's halving and doubling for the numbers that I've set up here. And so, again, higher shutter speeds you're better able to freeze action. Longer shutter speeds, of course, you can have motion blur if your subject is moving, or you could even, depending upon the magnification or the focal length of your lens, if you're using a long lens. It's possible that, again, just the movement or the shake of the lens, even with stabilization turned on, you might get a blurry photo with lower shutter speeds. So again, it's important to experiment with your gear, your cameras and lenses, and whatever you think you're going to be taking out in the field to see what's going to work best for you shooting situations. Now, here's something you might grab your phone and take a quick shot of the screen, or if your computer lets you do a screenshot. These are just some basic starting points. If your subject is motionless, you may be able to even go with a wide angle lens lower than a 60th of a second and still get a sharp image. And as your subject begins to move, your shutter speed is going to have to go incrementally higher and higher. Birds in flight, as you see with this hawk, this was a hawk at a rehabilitation program, and it's flying between 2 handlers. It was injured and it can't be released back into the wild, so it's become an ambassador for the animal rehab group, or the raptor rehab group, and it flies and short distances and will go between the handlers. But here at 1,000th of a second, even those feathers out on the wingtips are nice and sharp, and sometimes you may want a little motion blur in the shot. For instance, with this bald eagle, I shot this at a 500th of a second, and here again, those feathers right at the wingtips, that bird had just taken off from its perch to go hunting, and you can see that there is a little motion blur in the wingtip, those feathers at the tips, and I kind of like that. It shows a little bit of motion, especially on a gray overcast day like it was on the particular day that I made this photo. So sometimes motion blur isn't bad, but again, it's best to experiment with it. Now, other times motion blur can make for a beautiful abstract photo. And this is a situation, Tamron won't be going this year because the event's already unfortunately been canceled, but for many years we have participated in the Bosque del Apache Birding Festival, which is usually every late October, early November, as the sandhill cranes and snow geese are migrating back south for the winter from North America. And what you'll find here is if you go for a week, you're going to have plenty of opportunities morning and evening as the birds are taking off or returning to where they roost for sharp action photos. And you'll see plenty of those examples throughout the presentation. But, you know, like by day 3 or day 4, you're going, I have amassed thousands of photos of birds and they're beautiful, and I've got them in individuals and small groups and large groups, and they're all tack sharp and I've done a great job. Maybe I need to stretch my creative legs a little bit. So here, set the camera up on a tripod, drop the shutter speed down to a 1/15 of a second, fairly low ISO, even though it's before sunrise of ISO 400. At f11, you can see those sand hills down at the bottom of the frame there that are kind of walking around in the wetland. They haven't taken off yet, but it's like somebody fires a starting pistol and all of the snow geese just take off in mass. And there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of birds doing this. So by going with that long shutter speed and having the camera stabilized, you probably want to turn off stabilization when you go to a shutter speed that long, so that the stabilizer doesn't give you more blur on the images or the part of the image that you want to have sharp. It's a good idea on a tripod in many situations, and I'll talk situationally about this. You may need to shut off stabilization for longer exposures so that the stabilizer doesn't try and compensate for motion that's not there. Now this is that image that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And again, I was, my memory served, I was at 28 millimeters, of course, f2.8, ISO of 100, and a 1/160th of a second turned out to be the shutter speed in this scenario. And I was in aperture priority. I just let it pick the shutter speed, and my exposure compensation was probably set to maybe a -1, -0.7. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that so that I could get that rich saturated color of the sky. So those are some of those kind of things that that make the shutter speed make more sense. Now ISO, when we were back in the film days, was called ASA for the American Standards Organization. In Europe, they called it DIN. Eventually, it became International Standards Organization, and all cameras are calibrated the same, so that with, again, back in film and in the digital era now, we know that when we tell the camera ISO 100 or 400 or 1600 or wherever it is, the imaging sensor knows exactly how much energy to create to record the light based on the sensitivity that you programmed in. So the higher the number, the more sensitive the camera becomes to light. Now that comes at sometimes a cost of loss of sharpness, or more likely you'll see what we called in film grain, what we call in the electronic era noise, and it looks the same, but it's caused by two different things. And the higher the number, the more likely you're going to introduce noise into the photo. Now, sometimes you can't help but shooting at a high ISO. If you're shooting night sky like this was a 30-second exposure at 15 millimeters, and that's just as long as you can go. And I'll talk a little bit about this right at the tail end, before the movement of the planet starts to cause star trails. So here ISO 3200 at f4 on my lens, and a 30-second exposure gave me the correct exposure. But again, the lowest ISO you can shoot for the situation, you always want to aim for that to get the best color, the best saturation, the best sharpness. And then as you go up and go to higher and higher settings, of course, you're going to have to be concerned with noise. Now that can be dealt with in the camera, and there is in-camera noise reduction. I generally leave that turned off, and I'll do that as one of the few things I like to do in post. And the reason I generally do is because the in-camera noise reduction program that's built into your camera. If you make a 30-second exposure, it will then take 30 seconds to process the image before you can review it or even start making the next image. So that's why I generally leave it turned off in the camera, because I'm often wanting to shoot faster than the camera can process the image. So again, this might be a good time to take a quick screenshot or a snapshot of the screen so that you get these. Again, some of the newest cameras, there's a new camera that was introduced by Sony, or actually the third generation of their S7S series, which has a native ISO of 51,200. So it's a camera that's purpose built for shooting in very low light, and a lot of the newest cameras will give great performance even at very high ISOs. So it carries through even to lower price cameras. You're going to get better high ISO performance even in less expensive models, even with entry level cameras today, than you could on a camera 5 or 10 years ago. Stability is also an important thing when we're out in the field. My go-to basic stabilization item is a monopod. It allows me to move quickly, and especially when I'm doing sports or sports journalism, I'll use a monopod so that I can pick up my camera and lens and get out of the way if action on the sidelines is coming to me. I generally don't have to worry about that with birds, but the big benefit of using a monopod rather than just, again, going out all day or for several hours and hand holding is, you know, you've got the camera hanging off of your shoulders. Cameras and long lenses can get pretty heavy after a while. And you also have your arms kind of, you know, crooked up like that. And at the end of the day, or if you've been out shooting for several hours, if you don't have the camera on some sort of support, you're going to just walk away and you're going to be stiff and sore, and you're thinking, man, I need to find a hobby that doesn't hurt so much. So a monopod is a great easy to use tool. Again, the folks at Action Camera can explain to you. They have, you know, a rack full of them with different capabilities that they can explain what's going to work for your needs best. Now, the same with tripods, and I will often use a tripod in combination with something like this gimbal head that you see up in the upper right hand corner. And this is a device that, again, due to space reasons, I don't have mine set up here, but it allows the camera to tilt and up and down and to pan right and left very smoothly. So if you're following a bird in the air, or if you want to shoot a little video or something like that of birds in flight, it allows very smooth movement. And again, the store probably has a number of different models or suggestions and different price points that they can suggest for you, so that they're going to be able to hook you up with what's going to work best for your camera and lens combination and your pocketbook as well. And always important to do that. Now, I will say, again, especially with your tripod, buy the best one you think you're going to need, the most expensive one that you can afford, and it's going to last longer. It's going to serve you more, maybe more all-purpose, and simply it's the kind of thing. I have probably 7 or 8 tripods, and they all get used for different purposes, but there are 2 or 3 of them that are really good that I'm confident, you know, when I check out, like the good watch, what I'm not wearing today, my kids will be fighting over when I go to the big dark room in the sky. We'll talk a little bit about exposure compensation, and then we'll get on to the actual making of photos. Exposure compensation is really important. The scene that you see here is a camera light meter's kind of worst nightmare, because a camera light meter is calibrated to look, if you're in the evaluative or matrix metering mode, to look at kind of the entire scene and take everything into account. But when you have a bright background like this, you're going to run into a situation where if you don't make any compensation, the camera's going to end up with a silhouette. Now, you can switch to spot metering and maybe overcome that, or maybe even a center weighted metering. And again, your camera most likely has all 3 of those functionalities in the meter. I generally just leave my camera in the normal evaluative or matrix metering mode, and I'll use exposure compensation because, again, I shoot a lot. I know how my camera and I use several cameras, I know how their light meters react over time. So I know where I need to set. Now on your camera, you might find a button that has a plus minus next to it. You might find an analog dial with a scale like that. It might be an LCD scale. So again, best to check your manual or your body maker's tutorials to find out where these controls are, because I think they're probably, again, for my workflow, they're the way I control things if I'm shooting in any sort of automatic mode. This was put together by one of my colleagues, and we don't have a shot that shows what the meter thought was correct, but you can see by going to a -1 or a -2 setting on the left-hand side, how dramatically different that looks from overexposing by 1 or 2 stops on the right-hand side there. And again, go out in the backyard or to the neighborhood park or something, maybe shoot a few sunsets or sunrises or whatever, and or just subjects that are spotlit or backlit, where your subject is either brighter than the background or darker than the background, and experiment with exposure compensation to see what's going to work best, so that when you get out in the field, you're going to be prepared for that eventuality too. When you get out, we want to experiment with our lens and our cameras. Of course, use the zoom. If you're using prime or fixed lenses, move your feet. Sometimes even with your zoom, you're going to need to move your feet. Also, don't always think about shooting from your normal standing height. Get higher if you can. I will often carry, if I'm going to be working out of my car, I carry a little step ladder so I can get maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 feet above my scene, just to kind of look down or have a different perspective. Same thing, I will also carry a tarp and some kneeling pads, like gardener's kneeling pads, and I'll throw those on the ground if I want to get low and shoot a different perspective that way too. Experiment with your depth of field. Shoot some really wide open shots with shallow depth of field. Shoot some small aperture shots to emphasize the depth of field, and see what works best. Or, you know, it helps you by doing those things to envision exactly what you want to provide to the viewer in your photos. Composition, some basics to think about: thirds. Try and put a subject that's a third of the way in from the top or the bottom and from the left or right hand corner. It doesn't always work, but those can make for stronger compositions. Our brain likes to see odd numbers, and especially things in groups of 3 work really well. Leading lines, that can be a pathway in a scene. It might be a bird's wing leading up to its torso, something like that. Just something to draw the viewer's eye into what your main area of emphasis is. Again, it doesn't always work in bird photography, but never a bad idea to keep those things in mind. Also, many cameras have the ability to turn a grid on like that in your viewfinder or on your view screen, so that you can, again, have those cues in mind when you're out shooting. And again, my cameras have that, and I leave that grid turned on all the time, or almost all the time, just for, again, giving me those cues. Even though I've been shooting a long time, never hurts to remind myself about composition. And there comes the thunderstorm. We'll hope we don't have lightning knocking me off the air here. Know your location and know your subject. Read up about the kind of birds that live near you. Google, of course, is a great resource. Your state wildlife commission may have, again, things online or publications that you can get, so that you know about the birds where you live. I also am a big believer in the, if you want to learn more about identifying birds, this is the Roger Torrey Peterson bird guidebook, and there's even an app when you buy the book that you can download, so that you can, again, learn more about the types of birds you're shooting, making sure you're properly identifying them. I'm not a birder by nature. I'm a photographer, so tools like that, again, help me when I'm not sure, make sure I know what I'm identifying. And when you get out in the field, sometimes it's planning and preparation and luck all happening at the same time. And that's certainly the case with this great blue heron. There's a colony of them that live near my house. Their babies are growing and probably fledging or about to fledge from the nest. And I see this was shot a couple of years ago, late winter, early spring, when the birds were going out hunting in the afternoon for dinner and so on. And I prior to COVID, of course, I travel a lot for work, so I'm not home a lot. So I would drive out in the afternoon to where I knew they were hunting, and it's right off of a busy county road. I would pull off the highway onto the gravel, and sometimes that would startle or spook the birds, and they might, especially herons where I live, at least, are very kind of easily spooked, and they'll take off, with just anything that startles them. So after weeks of trial and error, I thought, well, I know they're here at 3:30 when I've been driving over to try and take photos. Maybe I should get here at 2:30 or 3, maybe before the birds get there. And sure enough, one afternoon I did that, got set up, did some test exposures, because as you can see, the bird was going to be very backlit in this shot, and I suspected, based on where they nest at, that it was going to be coming in from that direction. And sure enough, I was able to zoom out and start taking pictures, acquire focus, and again, just fire away. I put my camera always in continuous focus and continuous frame advance, so that when I push the shutter button, the camera will track the subject and focus on it, and it will also keep firing away as I'm holding the shutter release down. And as the bird got closer and closer and closer, finally I got lucky and it flew right in front of me, and I got this image. As you can see, backlit. I did some test exposures. I was at a 320th of a second. I knew that at that point, herons kind of glide into their landing. They're not flapping hard. So I knew that panning with the bird a 320th of a second was going to give me a sharp image. I shot at ISO 400 again based on my test exposures, and I set my exposure compensation to a plus 1.3, so that the bird, so that I would have details on the front side of the bird, which of course it's the other side is to the sun. So I got that beautiful fluorescence in its beak. Its eye is nice and sharp. These dead reeds at the bottom were reflecting light up nicely, so I illuminated the underbelly. And this is a kind of a once in a million shot. The bird was flying and flapped just right. If you know great blue herons, their wings are more that blue-gray color there. They're not blue like that, and this is no post-processing. This is simply just the oil and the surface of the wings, because birds' wings are oily, and that oil reflected the blue from the sky in just that one shot. The shot before and after, it looks like it's normal kind of grayish colored wings. But so again, practice and some luck was involved, and patience to get a shot like that. Now, when you're out in the field, another thing to think about: when birds take off and land, just like airplanes, they fly into the wind. We learn to fly by looking at birds. And so this particular morning, and this is kind of the Hitchcockian shot, the wind was at my back. I knew that the snow geese were going to come up over me. Here's another pro tip. This was a pretty chilly morning, so I was already dressed in layers and warm and water repellent clothes. Wear a hat too, because as they take off, if they fly right over you, they're dropping water, and they also drop other stuff sometimes when they take off flying. And I know a couple of people to my right and to my left got not only water droplets on them, but other substances that birds leave behind. So again, keep that in mind. Now, this was with the 100 to 400. Here again, just after sunrise, ISO 800, ISO 400, because the light was getting pretty bright. I'm at 800th of a second to, again, ensure stopping the wings. I'm at F14, so that I've got a fairly reasonable amount of depth of field. You notice the birds closest to the camera are a little bit soft, but it works overall. And I was at 150 millimeters here. Now, also notice this big cottonwood tree in the background. I was fairly close to the shoreline when I was making this photo. A day before, the wind was coming from camera left, and the birds were taking off that direction a little earlier in the morning, because you can see that warmer light. And I was also, with the 150 to 600, I was at 500 millimeters here. And look at, again, telephoto lenses not only increase magnification, but they compress distance. So there's the distance at 150 millimeters for that same tree. I was actually standing further back at 500 millimeters, but the tree physically looks larger in the frame. So again, when you're shooting with your telephoto, watch for those compression issues and make sure that your background appears the way you want it to appear. Now, sometimes it's just a simple composition of a single bird. Here I was able to also take advantage of the foothills in the distance in the background. I was shooting at a relatively large aperture here, again, just as the sun was coming up over the horizon. So I was at a high shutter speed to freeze action, and I was able to use that that kind of rule of thirds to have that background take up a third of the frame, even though it's, you know, it's not always top to bottom a third. Sometimes it can be a diagonal third of the frame. And because there was just a single bird in the image, that adds a little bit of depth and anchor to the frame. So with individual birds, sometimes having a little bit of your background or treetops or something like that can be useful in making a more visually pleasing composition. Now, here back in Florida, we found an osprey family, and there were 5 of them, and they were diving one after another in like 4 or 5 minute intervals. It was like somebody was running air traffic control on them and saying, "Okay, osprey number 2, it's ready to go in for a fish now." And they were coming up with a fish every time. And here's something where, again, a single bird in the frame works pretty well. You'll notice that, again, I put the rule of thirds kind of into play, and I gave some negative space over here on the left-hand side of the frame so that the bird isn't bunched right up against the frame. It's nice to have a little bit of room for a subject to fly into like that. So keep that in mind too, compositionally. Try and keep them out of the center of your frame. Again, here, just a matter of different times of day. You get that beautiful warm light at sunrise, which is what the shot that we have camera left, and it generally tends to be a little softer light coming through maybe morning fog. The afternoon light, as pollutants and particulate matter gets stirred up in the air, and you know, humans are moving around, the light looks a little different in the evening generally than it does in the morning. So keep that in mind. And again, I've got light right behind over my shoulder, very flat, broad light here. The birds were kind of coming toward me with crossing light, so I was able to get kind of a more portrait effect of highlight and shadow with, again, a slightly backlit subject. Both of these images were shot at about 300 millimeters f/16 and 1600 ISO, so that I could get a 500th of a second shutter speed. Well, at least on that one. This one was at a, I'm sorry, slightly different shot at 400 millimeters. So again, I'm putting my own data up there and then reading notes which are not fully accurate. When you get to looking at smaller birds, catching them in flight becomes much more difficult. This is a North American kestrel, the smallest of the falcons, and they fly like crazy. So this little fella, I found it 2 or 3 years in a row, or if it's not the same bird, it at least likes to perch on this same tree. And as you can see, late winter, early spring, the tree is just starting to bud out. So I'm not having to deal with foliage in this shot, just a clear blue sky that afternoon. And again, very bright sunlight coming in directly from camera left high in the sky. And here, it's just, again, that rule of thirds. When you have a vertical subject like this, never a bad idea to turn the camera vertically rather than shooting horizontally. And again, as I snapped it for several frames. It got bored of posing for me or saw something it wanted to go hunting and took off. And again, they fly like crazy, and I wasn't quite at that moment prepared for it, but I got a lot of great still shots like that. Again, smaller birds are going to be much easier to photograph, especially as you're learning bird photography, catching them when they're perched somewhere. So this was simply, again, I've got that nice diagonal line, not hitting the corner, just barely missed the corner on the bottom. But again, that breaks up a frame really nicely. You've got that diagonal, and again, kind of a third, and a third. So the rule of thirds, again, comes into a bit of play, and the branch also can act as kind of your leading line, if you will, in a situation like this. We do a workshop with a couple of camera stores in Detroit where we go out to a regional park, and the regional park sells bird food and will allow you to literally hold your hand out full of food, and birds will come in and land on your hand. I don't necessarily, other than in I think it's called Kingston Park in suburban Detroit, I don't necessarily recommend doing this in your backyard. But again, the birds are all acclimated to humans, and they'll fly right up and land on your hand. I thought it was, hilarious and kind of terrifying at the same time that the birds are that acclimated to people, because again, I'm sure there weren't as many people in the park this spring feeding them, so they were probably having to hunt a lot harder for their food and not relying on people to feed them. Sometimes, again, when you get into the deep shade, you're going to have to go to a very high ISO. This woodpecker I had to shoot at ISO 1600. I was at a 250th of a second at about f6.3. I was shooting wide open on the 18-400 camera. And this is also, you'll notice it's a little noisy. This is about a 75% crop. Sometimes if you're getting too close to the bird that they start to change their behavior, you're too close. You need to back off. And in this case, it was simply a matter of I couldn't get physically closer. I was on a trail, and I would have had to literally start breaking brush to get through to get physically closer. But I also think that the bird would have spooked and taken off. So again, a longer focal length, and sometimes you're still going to have to crop. And again, be comfortable with the ISO, the high ISO in your camera. Another good tip I should bring up, kind of out of sequence here, but when we go back to talking about those ISOs, it's not a bad idea, especially if you have a new camera or if you're just not familiar with how your camera performs at the different ISO sensitivities. Go out and again, maybe late afternoon or dusk, and shoot 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and as high as you want to go to see what your camera is capable of doing, and review them not only on your computer screen, but also maybe make some 8x10 prints. Take them into Action Camera, have them print them in their lab for you. Prints are pretty affordable, just so you can have some really good idea of especially the higher ISOs and what you're comfortable with. You may decide that you don't want to shoot your camera at ISO settings above 1600, or you might be comfortable up to 3200 or 6400 or even beyond, but it's good to know. So again, you know, if you're making prints or enlargements, especially at those high ISOs, just what's going to work, and you'll know when it's maybe time to just put the camera away and enjoy the scene. This is another one of those situations where using technology is important. I was shooting with the 100 to 400, which of course has built-in stabilization, and a lot of the new mirrorless cameras have in-body stabilization too, which allows us to make our lenses smaller and lighter because we don't have to build a stabilizer into them. But here I was using the 100 to 400, great stabilization in that lens, and I was able to shoot at 125th of a second at 400 millimeters handheld. Again, just after sunset, kind of in that what we call the blue hour, still had nice clean light, but again, I was up to ISO 800. and pretty wide open. I was at f7.1. So at 400 millimeters, that's a third of a stop down from wide open on that lens. And I was able to get a great shot. If I had taken the time to pull the tripod out, lock the camera down on a tripod, you know, again, the bird had decided a few moments after posing for these shots that it was time to go hunting or go back to the nest or whatever, and it took off. So again, use stabilization and shoot handheld if you have to. And again, know the limitations of your camera and lens stabilization. Last fall at Bosque del Apache, it rained for 2 days, and people were freaking out, thinking they weren't going to get good bird photos because the birds were kind of hunkered down in the rain. Well, day number 3, it was my turn to get out early, and I looked out the window at 4 in the morning when the alarm went off, and it was so foggy out I couldn't see 50 feet across the parking lot from my hotel room window to where my car was parked. And I thought, this is going to make for some interesting challenges. And you know, again, I looked at the weather forecast, and I was going to go out and shoot regardless, because there's always things to photograph, even if your primary topic is fogged in. But we got lucky, and the fog did begin to lift at just before sunrise, but it was still foggy for most of the morning. And I could hear, you know, the group I was with, I was explaining to people, this is magic light. You don't get foggy mornings all that often in that part of the country. And it's fun to be able to shoot something that's going to be that soft, ethereal look, that's not going to be that tack sharp bird. And I looked at the weather forecast. I knew that the next few days, the rain was gone, and it was going to be clear and bright, and the fog, you know, of course, moved on as well. But we got some great shots that morning, and people to our left and right were complaining, oh, I'm never going to get a sharp photo. You know, make the most of your shooting situation and take those beautiful, soft, ethereal photos, because again, at least in this part of the country, the humidity is typically so low, we don't get foggy mornings very often. So it was kind of a treat for me to be able to shoot in those conditions. As the birds finally did decide to take off, again, they're kind of in the mist, they're kind of in the fog. Don't have to add anything in post to soften an image here. And just, again, we had to shoot at higher ISOs. This was probably an hour after sunrise when the geese decided to take off, and I was still shooting at 3200 ISO and panning at 1/100th of a second at f10, because I hadn't readjusted my shutter speed. But again, panning, it was a high enough shutter speed to catch some good motion there. And again, I've kind of got my group of 3 there in that scene. I followed the birds around for another couple of hours that morning, and found where they were going to, you know, where they flew off to hunt in this wetland area for the day. And again, another fog bank had moved back in. It was actually clearer 5 minutes before I made this shot, but these 2 geese were coming in for a landing. And again, you got that compositional cue. They create that rule of thirds very nicely, and kind of a leading line into where they're going to land, even though there's not a visual leading line. The brain looks at it that way, so that's kind of nice. Again, that same morning, I had my my brand new at that time 24 millimeter lens for my Sony with me, and I had that hanging off my my shoulder, as well as the telephoto lenses, and got this beautiful shot of the autumn color and the herons. I'm sorry, not the herons, the sandhill cranes just taking off and flying kind of lazily behind this tree. So again, wide angle shots can make for great exposures. This was last spring. Actually, we had a late spring snowstorm, and I went out to photograph my my friends, the great blue herons. And as you can see, this poor guy was molting and was losing feathers off of his wing a little bit there, but still kind of a cool shot. Again, cloudy, snowy day, 1600 ISO, 1/1000th of a second at f18. It was kind of cloudy bright, so I didn't have to go to a lower shutter speed, and I was able to get a nice in-flight shot. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I went out just for fun to experiment with the high ISO on one of my cameras. This is with a Nikon D500, which is a great performer with telephoto lenses. It's a lot of people think that it's one of the perfect choices to pair with the Tamron 150 to 600. Not that there aren't a lot of other great camera choices, but again, it has a high frame rate and it does very well at high ISOs. Just for fun, this heron, this was well after sunset into the blue hour. And I shot this at 12,800 ISO just to see what my lens could do. And handheld, I was at 600 millimeters at 125th of a second. So again, that's Tamron stabilization technology at work in that lens. It got me a very cool shot. And then the 20 or 30 minutes later, it got, you know, it was well into dusk at this point, and I bumped my ISO up to 40,000 again just to see what my camera could do. And here I'm at a 40th of a second handheld at f8. That's how dark it was. I could barely see the bird standing on this log that's anchored out in a nearby lake that the Parks Department has put out on the lake for again for watchable wildlife. They put these logs out in the lake and let them float. They've anchored them to the bottom, and that way the birds have a safe place to roost offshore too. So look for those kinds of things. And we'll kind of wrap it up here. I mentioned I have several families of osprey nesting nearby. These two, this is Johnny, that's June. Those are my wife's and my name for them. And as the osprey was just standing here on the telephone pole near the nesting box, and this is a big group. You don't always see osprey hatching 3 young'uns at once. So you know the osprey's telling the pigeon Bob, I'm ready to be an empty nester anytime now. And those birds are getting ready to fledge. They're pretty big. They're almost as big as their parents. And I also mentioned Frank and Lola, and that's Frank, and there's Lola. And Lola has, you can see just one little head peeking out and another one there. It looks like they had two babies this year, and very cool. So I like to find those kinds of things, and I'll go back out several times over the next few weeks. Frank and Lola's were taken a day later than Johnny and June, and their babies are much larger. So you know, Frank and Lola hatched their young'uns. I'm guessing a week or 10 days, maybe 2 weeks after that other set of birds. And so we get to enjoy seeing the babies grow up, and they'll be starting to take flight here in the next few weeks. Again, there's Frank standing on the that telephone pole next to the or power pole next to the nesting box. Just kind of had come in for a landing there. And you know, when a group of geese is really simpatico, when they're even swimming in a V formation. I normally don't put bird butts in, but I just kind of found this funny. Also, look for those big birds in the sky. I have apps on my phone that will tell me when the International Space Station is flying over, and it alerted me to this. I was actually pointing the camera the other direction to photograph the Milky Way rising, but I couldn't resist turning around and getting this shot of the space station coming over. This is a 30-second exposure at f4 at ISO 3200. And in 30 seconds, that's how far the space station traveled. I suspect that's a little meteor, and down there is a plane flying way off in the distance. That dome of light that you see there is Cheyenne, Wyoming, about 60 or 70 miles away from where I was. This is 2.5 hours after sunset, and there was still that much light along the western horizon too. And you may have encountered that if you were trying to capture the comet the last couple of weeks. The formula, by the way, for getting good night sky exposures where the stars are pinpointed like this is take your focal length and divide it by 500. So with a 30 millimeter or 15 millimeter focal length, that gives me 30.333 seconds. And that's how long I can expose before the Earth's rotation starts to cause um, uh, star trails. If I was shooting a 50 millimeter lens, I could only shoot 10 seconds before, again, the magnification of that lens started to see star trails. A couple of other tips. A polarizing filter is a really handy accessory. The folks at Action Camera can tell you more about polarizers. They reduce reflected glare, so if you're shooting birds around water, especially midday, that can be really handy. It works best at a right angle to the sun, so keep the sun kind of over your shoulder, but they can also make the sky a darker blue, have the clouds stand out better against the sky. So just a great extra tool to use. So that's about it for this section. Again, if you come up with a question that you forget about, or you want to follow me on social media, I'm Tamron Tech Jeff, or you can drop me a note if you have a question.